The machine kept beeping. The sterile white walls of UCLA Medical Center seemed to close in on themselves, carrying the weight of something that felt impossible. John Wayne was dying. The Duke. The man who'd stared down outlaws and Indians, who'd won wars on screen and stood tall through every storm Hollywood threw at him, was now a frail shadow beneath hospital sheets, his legendary frame reduced to bones and willpower. It was late spring, 1979, and everyone who walked through that door brought the same thing. Pity. Sad eyes. Whispered condolences. The kind of quiet that comes before a funeral. They treated him like he was already gone. But then, one afternoon, the door opened, and in walked Dean Martin. And everything changed. Dean didn't shuffle in solemnly, like the others. He didn't bring flowers or wear that somber expression that screamed, "I'm here to say goodbye."
No.
Dean Martin walked in like he was strolling into the Sands Hotel in Vegas, a smirk already forming on his lips, and before anyone could process what was happening, he looked at John Wayne, gaunt, weak, barely holding on, and said something nobody expected. He cracked a joke. Not a gentle one, either. A real Dean Martin zinger, the kind that would have gotten him punched in any other circumstance. And for the first time in weeks, John Wayne laughed. A real laugh. The kind that came from somewhere deep, somewhere that cancer hadn't touched. In that moment, John Wayne wasn't a dying man. He was Duke again. And Dean Martin had just broken every unspoken rule about how you're supposed to act around someone on their deathbed. This is the story of that visit. But more than that, it's the story of a friendship that Hollywood rarely sees. One built not on red carpets and publicists, but on shared bottles of whiskey, brutal honesty, and the understanding that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone isn't sympathy. It's treating them exactly like you always have. Because sympathy is what you give strangers. But friends? Friends give you hell right up until the end. To understand why Dean Martin's final visit to John Wayne mattered so much, you have to understand who these men were. Not the characters they played, but the souls beneath the swagger. John Wayne wasn't born the Duke. He was Marion Robert Morrison, a kid from Iowa who got his nickname from his childhood dog. That's right, one of the most masculine icons in American cinema was named after an Airedale Terrier named Duke. The name stuck, but so did something else, a work ethic that bordered on obsession and a stubbornness that could move mountains or destroy relationships, depending on which side of it you were on. Wayne's rise to stardom wasn't overnight. He spent years as a prop man, a stuntman, a background player in forgettable B-movies. Director John Ford saw something in him, something raw and authentic, and gave him his break in Stagecoach in 1939. From that moment on, John Wayne became America. He was the cowboy, the soldier, the man who did what needed to be done without apology. He starred in over 170 films, became a box office titan, and built an image so powerful that people forgot Marion Morrison ever existed. But beneath the tough exterior, Wayne was more complicated than anyone gave him credit for. He was deeply patriotic, politically conservative, and could hold a grudge like nobody's business. He also had a surprisingly soft side. He cried at weddings, doted on his kids, and had a weakness for sentimental poetry. John Wayne was a walking contradiction, a gentle tough guy, a romantic warrior, a man who could deck you with one punch or recite Shakespeare depending on his mood. By 1979, Wayne had survived a lot. He'd beaten lung cancer in 1964, losing a lung and several ribs in the process. Doctors told him he'd never work again. He proved them wrong, coming back to win his only Oscar for True Grit in 1970. But cancer is a patient enemy. It came back, this time in his stomach, and this time it wasn't leaving. Wayne knew it. His family knew it. And so did Dean Martin. Dean Martin, born Dino Paul Crocetti in Steubenville, Ohio, was the son of Italian immigrants. He grew up speaking only Italian until he was 5, worked as a bootlegger's driver during Prohibition, and boxed under the name Kid Crochet before finding his way into entertainment. Dean had the kind of charisma that couldn't be taught, smooth, effortless, with a voice that sounded like honey poured over gravel. He could sing, he could act, and most importantly, he made it all look easy. That was his genius. Everyone else in Hollywood was trying so hard. Dean looked like he just rolled out of bed and stumbled onto the set with a cocktail in hand. Of course, that was partly an act. Dean's drunk persona was mostly stagecraft. He often had apple juice in his glass instead of whiskey. But the laid-back attitude? That was real. Dean didn't stress. He didn't chase awards or worry about legacy. He showed up, did the work, got paid, and went home to his family or the golf course. That attitude drove some people crazy, but it's exactly what drew John Wayne to him. The two men first worked together on Rio Bravo in 1959, directed by Howard Hawks. On paper, they shouldn't have clicked. Wayne was the ultimate professional, always early to set, always prepared. Dean was notorious for showing up late, barely rehearsing, and nailing his scenes in one take because he couldn't be bothered to do another. Wayne usually hated actors like that. But something about Dean was different. Maybe it was because Dean's talent was undeniable. When the camera rolled, he delivered. Or maybe it was because Dean treated Wayne like he was just another guy, not a legend, not the Duke, just Duke. No reverence, no awe. Just two guys making a Western. Rio Bravo became one of Wayne's favorite films, not just because of the final product, but because of what happened between takes. Dean kept things light. He'd crack jokes, tease Wayne about his rigid approach to acting, and somehow make the notoriously serious actor loosen up. There's a famous story from the set where Wayne was frustrated with a difficult scene, tension building, the crew walking on eggshells. Dean sauntered over, looked at Wayne, and said something along the lines of, "Jesus, Duke, you look like you're trying to pass a bowling ball. Relax." The crew held their breath, waiting for Wayne to explode. Instead, he burst out laughing, the tension evaporated, and they nailed the scene on the next take. That was the beginning. After Rio Bravo, they stayed in touch. When they reunited for The Sons of Katie Elder in 1965, the friendship deepened. By then, Wayne was dealing with his first cancer diagnosis, though few people knew about it. Dean knew. And Dean did what Dean did best. He didn't treat Wayne like a patient. He didn't ask how he was feeling or tiptoe around the subject. He just showed up, made jokes, and reminded Wayne that life was still worth living. During the filming of Katie Elder, Wayne was in pain, exhausted from the surgery and recovery. Dean noticed, but he never mentioned it directly. Instead, he'd find ways to lighten Wayne's load. He'd nail his scenes faster, so Wayne could rest. He'd keep the mood on set upbeat, so Wayne didn't have time to dwell on his mortality. And when they wrapped each day, Dean would sometimes invite Wayne out for a drink, not to get drunk, just to sit, talk, and be two guys who understood each other without needing to say much. That's what real friendship looks like. It's not grand gestures or emotional speeches. It's showing up. It's knowing when to joke and when to shut up. It's treating someone like they're still alive even when the world is already mourning them. The years rolled on. Wayne kept working, kept fighting, kept being Duke. But by early 1979, the fight was ending. The stomach cancer had spread, and no amount of willpower could stop it. Wayne checked into UCLA Medical Center in April for an experimental treatment, but everyone knew it was a long shot. The world started preparing for the inevitable. News outlets drafted obituaries. Fellow actors began sharing their memories. The tone was clear. We're losing a legend. Get ready to say goodbye. Wayne hated it. He hated the pity, hated the way people looked at him like he was already a ghost. Visitors came in waves, old friends, co-stars, Hollywood royalty. They meant well, but their visits all felt the same. Quiet, respectful, sad. They'd sit by his bed, hold his hand, tell him how much he meant to them, how much they'd miss him. It was like attending his own wake. Wayne was too weak to protest, too tired to put on the tough guy act. So he let them come, let them cry, let them say their goodbyes. But inside, he was still fighting. He wasn't ready to be a memory. And then Dean Martin showed up. Nobody knows exactly what day it was, sometime in late May, just a couple of weeks before Wayne's death on June 11th. The hospital was quiet, the afternoon sun filtering through the blinds. Wayne's family was there, his son Michael, maybe a nurse checking vitals. The door opened and in walked Dean. No fanfare, no tears. Just Dean, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else but knowing he had to be there. Wayne's eyes opened, tired, clouded, but still sharp enough to recognize his old friend. And before anyone could say a word, Dean looked at him, shook his head, and said something that would have gotten him thrown out of any other hospital room. The exact words have been lost to time, remembered differently by those who were there. Some say Dean took one look at Wayne and said, "Jesus, Duke, you look terrible. I've seen better-looking corpses." Others remember him saying, "I thought you were supposed to be tough. You're getting soft on me." The specifics don't matter. What matters is that Dean Martin, standing in front of his dying friend, refused to play along with the funeral atmosphere. He didn't cry. He didn't hold Wayne's hand and tell him it was okay to let go. He did what he'd always done. He gave Duke hell. And John Wayne, who hadn't laughed in days, who was so weak he could barely lift his head, laughed. A real, genuine, deep-from-the-gut laugh that startled everyone in the room. For a moment, the machines seemed quieter. The weight in the air lifted. John Wayne wasn't a dying man. He was Duke, and his buddy Dean was busting his chops like always. They talked. Not about death or regrets or unfinished business. They talked about the old days. About the time Dean showed up late to the Rio Bravo set and Wayne threatened to have him fired, a bluff they both knew he'd never follow through on. About the poker games on Wayne's yacht, the Wild Goose, where Dean would clean everyone out and Wayne would accuse him of cheating. He probably was. About the time they got into an argument over politics. Wayne was a hardcore conservative, Dean couldn't care less, and ended up laughing because neither could convince the other of anything. They talked about movies, about golf, about Dean's kids and Wayne's kids. They talked about life, not death. At some point, Dean pulled out a cigarette. A nurse rushed over, reminding him that smoking wasn't allowed in the hospital, especially not in a patient's room. Dean looked at her, then at Wayne, and said, "You gonna let her tell me what to do, Duke?" Wayne, barely able to speak, croaked out, "Light it." So, Dean did. He lit a cigarette in John Wayne's hospital room, in defiance of every rule and regulation, because that's what friends do. They break the rules when it matters. They sat in silence for a while, Dean smoking, Wayne resting, both of them comfortable in the quiet. There was no need to say everything out loud. They'd known each other long enough to understand what wasn't being said. Dean knew this was the last time he'd see his friend. Wayne knew it too, but neither of them acknowledged it. To acknowledge it would be to admit defeat, and neither of these men had ever been good at admitting defeat. Eventually, Dean stubbed out the cigarette, stood up, and said something simple. Maybe it was "see you around, Duke." Maybe it was just "take it easy." Whatever it wasn't goodbye. Because saying goodbye would mean it was over, and Dean wasn't ready to admit that. Wayne nodded, his eyes already closing again, exhaustion pulling him back under. Dean walked to the door, paused for just a second, maybe to take one last look, maybe just to gather himself, and then he left. No tears. No dramatics. Just Dean Martin walking out of John Wayne's hospital room the same way he'd walked in, like nothing was wrong. Less than 2 weeks later, on June 11th, 1979, John Wayne died. He was 72 years old. His death made headlines around the world. The president issued a statement. Hollywood mourned. Thousands attended his funeral. Frank Sinatra wept openly. James Stewart could barely get through his eulogy. The whole world stopped to say goodbye to an American icon. But in the midst of all that grief, there was Dean Martin, standing in the back, not crying, not making a scene. Just there. Because that's what friends do. They show up. After the funeral, someone asked Dean how he was holding up. Dean, never one for emotional displays, just shrugged and said something to the effect of, "Duke was tough. He went out on his own terms." But those who knew Dean well noticed something different in him after that. He was quieter. He didn't joke as much. Losing John Wayne had taken something out of him, something he'd never really get back. Years later, Dean's daughter Deanna Martin shared stories about her father's friendship with Wayne. She said that her dad never talked much about that final visit, but she knew it had meant everything to him. Dean wasn't the type to wear his heart on his sleeve, but he'd loved Duke. Really loved him. And the greatest gift he could give his friend at the end wasn't pity or tears. It was normalcy. It was treating Duke like he was still Duke, not a dying man, but the same tough, stubborn, larger-than-life guy he'd always been. That's the thing about real friendship. It doesn't change just because circumstances do. Fair-weather friends disappear when things get hard. Real friends show up. They don't bring you sympathy. They bring you life. They remind you of who you are, not who you're becoming. Dean Martin understood that. And John Wayne, in his final days, needed that more than anything. It's easy to look at Dean's behavior and think it was disrespectful. Cracking jokes at a dying man's bedside? Smoking in a hospital room? Refusing to say a proper goodbye. But that's missing the point entirely. Dean wasn't disrespecting Wayne. He was honoring him. He was honoring their friendship, their history, everything they'd been to each other. The world wanted to mourn John Wayne. Dean wanted to celebrate him. And in those final moments in that hospital room, he gave Duke something no one else could. The gift of being himself one last time. There's a photograph from around that time, Dean visiting Wayne in the hospital. It's grainy, black and white, probably taken by a family member. In it, Dean is leaning against the wall, arms crossed, that trademark smirk on his face. Wayne is in bed, thin and frail, but his eyes are open, and if you look close enough, you can see the hint of a smile. It's not a sad photo. It's not a deathbed scene. It's just two old friends hanging out, same as they'd been doing for 20 years. That photo captures something most people never understood about Dean Martin. He wasn't unfeeling or callous. He just understood that sometimes the most respectful thing you can do for someone is refuse to treat them any differently. Hollywood has had a lot of great friendships over the years. Bogart and Bacall, Newman and Redford, Hepburn and Tracy. But there was something uniquely American about Wayne and Martin. They were products of a different era. Men who didn't talk about their feelings, who communicated through ribbing and silence, who showed love not through words, but through presence. In today's world, we're told that emotional vulnerability is strength, that talking about your feelings is healthy, that saying, "I love you" is important. And maybe it is. But Dean and Duke came from a generation that believed some things didn't need to be said. You just knew. The story of Dean Martin's final visit to John Wayne has become something of a legend in Hollywood circles. It gets retold at bars and dinner parties, sometimes embellished, sometimes simplified, but always with the same core truth. Dean Martin refused to mourn his friend while he was still alive. And in doing so, he gave John Wayne something infinitely more valuable than sympathy. He gave him dignity. Think about the last time you visited someone in the hospital. Maybe it was a grandparent, a parent, a friend. Think about how you acted. Did you whisper? Did you treat them like they were fragile? Did you avoid certain topics, dance around the obvious, pretend everything was fine when it clearly wasn't? Most of us do that. It's instinct. We don't want to upset them. We don't want to make things worse. But what if that's exactly what makes things worse? What if pretending everything is normal is actually more comforting than acknowledging how abnormal everything has become? Dean Martin understood that. He didn't have a degree in psychology or grief counseling. He just knew his friend. He knew that John Wayne didn't want to be treated like a victim. He knew that Duke had spent his entire life being the strong one, the hero, the guy who didn't quit. And even at the end, especially at the end, Wayne needed to be that guy one more time. Dean gave him that. Not through pity or false hope, but through authentic, unchanged friendship. It's worth noting that not everyone understood Dean's approach. Some people thought he was cold. How could he joke around with a dying man? How could he not cry, not show emotion, not acknowledge the gravity of the situation? But those criticisms came from people who didn't understand the relationship. They didn't know that Dean and Duke had spent years giving each other hell. They didn't know that their friendship was built on sarcasm, competition, and mutual respect. They didn't know that for these two men, emotion wasn't shown through tears, it was shown through loyalty. And Dean showed up. That said everything. In the years since Wayne's death, many of his co-stars and friends have shared their memories. Maureen O'Hara, who starred with Wayne in 5 films and was one of his closest friends, talked about visiting him in the hospital. She said it was heartbreaking, that seeing Duke so weak was almost unbearable. She held his hand, told him she loved him, and left in tears. That's not wrong. That's human. But it's also why Dean's visit stands out. He didn't leave in tears. He left the same way he came in, with a nod, a smirk, and the unspoken understanding that they'd had a good run. James Stewart, another close friend, delivered a eulogy at Wayne's funeral that left everyone in tears. He talked about Duke's courage, his integrity, his love for his family, and his country. It was beautiful and heartfelt, and everything a eulogy should be. But Dean didn't speak at the funeral. He didn't need to. He'd already said everything that mattered in that hospital room, in their last conversation, when he treated his friend like a human being instead of a dying legend. There's a lesson in this story, one that extends far beyond Hollywood or celebrities or old westerns. It's about how we treat the people we love when they're at their lowest. Do we give them what we think they need, or do we give them what they actually need? Do we project our own fears and sadness onto them, or do we give them the space to be themselves? Dean Martin chose the latter. He didn't make Wayne's death about himself or his grief. He made it about Duke. He let his friend be Duke one last time. And that's a gift that can't be measured. It's also a testament to the kind of man Dean Martin was. For all his I don't care attitude, for all the jokes and the drinking and the surface-level charm, Dean cared deeply about the people in his life. He just showed it differently. He didn't wear his heart on his sleeve. He wore it in his actions. And when it mattered most, when his friend was dying and the world was falling apart, Dean showed up and did the hardest thing. He acted like everything was normal. Because sometimes, normal is the greatest gift you can give. The friendship between John Wayne and Dean Martin also speaks to a broader truth about the golden age of Hollywood. These weren't just actors playing parts. They were men forging real relationships, building real bonds, in an industry that often felt fake and transactional. Wayne and Martin didn't need each other for career advancement. By the time they met, both were already established stars. Their friendship wasn't strategic, it was genuine. And that's rare, even today. In a world of networking and brand management and calculated relationships, the idea of two guys just liking each other, just enjoying each other's company without an agenda, feels almost revolutionary. And let's not forget the broader context of 1979. This was the end of an era. The old guard of Hollywood was fading. The studio system that had made Wayne and Martin stars was long gone, replaced by a new generation of filmmakers and actors. Wayne represented something that was disappearing, a certain kind of masculinity, a certain kind of heroism, a certain kind of America. His death wasn't just the loss of a man, it was the loss of an ideal. People mourned him so deeply because they felt like they were losing a part of themselves. But Dean didn't mourn the ideal. He mourned his friend. And there's something beautiful and uncomplicated about that. In the decades since Wayne's death, countless biographies, documentaries, and retrospectives have analyzed his life and legacy. Scholars debate his politics, his impact on American culture, his complicated relationship with Native Americans and race. All of that is important. But sometimes, the most important moments aren't the big public ones. They're the quiet, private ones. A friend walking into a hospital room. A joke cracked at the worst possible time. A cigarette smoked in defiance of the rules. A final conversation that no one else gets to hear. Those are the moments that define us. Not our achievements or our accolades, but how we treat the people we love when no one's watching. Dean Martin died on Christmas Day, 1995, at the age of 78. By then, most of the old guard was gone. Sinatra would follow 3 years later, and Stewart had passed the year before. The Rat Pack, the Cowboys, the icons of mid-century Hollywood, they were all disappearing one by one. When Dean died, there weren't many people left who remembered what it was like in the old days. But those who did, those who had known Dean and Duke and the rest, they remembered that hospital visit. They remembered the story of Dean refusing to say goodbye, of making Duke laugh one last time, of treating his friend with dignity instead of pity. And they understood that in that moment, Dean Martin had done something heroic. Not in the John Wayne movie sense, where the hero rides in and saves the day. But in the real sense, where the hero shows up and does the hard thing even when it hurts. That's what makes this story resonate. It's not about fame or movies or Hollywood legends. It's about friendship. It's about loyalty. It's about showing up for the people you love and giving them what they need, not what everyone else thinks they need. It's about refusing to let someone become a symbol or a tragedy or a cautionary tale when they're still a person. Dean Martin did that for John Wayne. And in doing so, he gave us all a blueprint for how to love someone at the end. Not with tears and sympathy and gentle whispers, but with laughter and irreverence and the stubborn insistence that they're still the person you've always known. Because they are. Right up until the very end. They are. When John Wayne took his last breath on June 11th, 1979, surrounded by his family, he wasn't thinking about his legacy or his filmography or his place in American history. He was probably thinking about the people he loved. His kids. His friends. The life he'd lived. And somewhere in there, maybe he thought about Dean Martin walking into his room, refusing to play along with the sadness, making him laugh when he thought he'd forgotten how. Maybe that memory brought him some peace. Maybe it reminded him that even at the end, he was still Duke. Still the guy his friends could tease. Still the guy who mattered. Not because of what he'd accomplished, but because of who he was. That's the power of friendship. It doesn't care about your resume or your accolades. It sees you, the real you, and it refuses to let you forget who that is, even when everything else is falling apart. Dean Martin saw John Wayne. Not the icon. Not the legend. Just Duke. His friend. The guy he'd shared a drink with, argued with, laughed with. And in that final visit, he gave Duke the greatest gift, the reminder that he was still alive. Still here. Still himself. Hollywood doesn't make men like Dean Martin and John Wayne anymore. Maybe that's progress. Maybe the world is better off without that kind of old-school machismo and emotional repression. Maybe we've evolved past the need for stoic cowboys and crooning tough guys. Or maybe we've lost something. Maybe in our rush to be vulnerable and open and emotionally available, we've forgotten that there's strength in silence. There's love in loyalty. There's comfort in being treated like you're still you, even when you're not. Dean Martin understood that. He didn't need to say, "I love you," to show it. He just needed to show up, crack a joke, and light a cigarette in a hospital room. And John Wayne, who'd spent his entire life being strong, got to be strong one more time. Because his friend let him. The story of Dean Martin's final visit to John Wayne is more than just a Hollywood anecdote. It's a reminder of what real friendship looks like. It's messy. It's complicated. It doesn't always follow the rules. It doesn't always look the way people expect. But it's there. It shows up. It refuses to let you face the end alone. And it gives you the one thing you need most. The chance to be yourself one last time. So here's to Dean Martin. Here's to refusing to cry when everyone expects you to. Here's to breaking the rules when it matters. Here's to treating your friends like they're still alive, even when they're dying. And here's to John Wayne, who got to laugh one more time, who got to be Duke one more time, because his friend refused to let him be anything else. That's love. That's friendship. That's everything.